Welcome back to Questions for the Rector. I'm your host, Stephen Heiner, and with us, as always, is the Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary in Reading, Pennsylvania, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn. Hello, Your Excellency.
Hello, Stephen.
I was telling you the other day that I'd been reading Father Fahey recently, and he put together a series of 3 R's that I thought were really interesting, and I thought you could give our watchers and our listeners some insight into this. And his 3 R's were the Renaissance, the Reformation, or the Revolt, if you want to call it that, and the Revolution. And that these 3 R's really shape the way that our lives are as moderns. So let's start with the Renaissance. Tell our watchers and listeners, firstly, what that is. And then my first question is, what evils were given because of this?
Well, the Renaissance means rebirth. It's from a French word. And it means the rebirth of classical culture. How would you say, where people were paying more attention to the classical culture, Latin and Greek scholars of ancient times. In itself, that was not something horrible. In other words, that you're reading Cicero or you're reading Caesar or something like that, and you're learning classical Latin, classical Greek. That is not horrible in itself. As a matter of fact, those things were preserved during the Middle Ages. That's why those works were available. But what was bad about the Renaissance was that this classical culture was then placed on a pedestal in such a way that man was considered without original sin and without redemption, that he was considered as man. In other words, just without any reference to his sin or his redemption. So that totally changed the outlook of the entire Christian world. Now there were some humanists, what we call humanists at that time, who were simply interested in the classical literature, like St. Thomas More, but who were not infected with that idea. But some were very infected with the idea of man without sin, man without redemption, a totally naturalistic way of looking at the human race. And you see this in a very striking way. In the Middle Ages, you never see any painting, any art at all, any pictorial art of nudity, with one exception, and that is Adam and Eve. In all of the other religious art, all art, there was never any nudity. Renaissance, everybody takes his clothes off and her clothes off too. You know, even the Sistine Chapel, people, in various stages of undress and whatnot. So much so that St. Pius V had clothing put on the Last Judgment painting because he didn't want to raise the host and see filth. That's Michelangelo. He was the prince of that whole spirit, the David statue, which has nothing to do with David. It is a statement of man as man in his nudity. You see, without sin. The reason why we wear clothes is because of sin. It's in Genesis. They had to cover themselves, you see. So that's man, and you see pagan art, you go to the museum, all of the Greek art is almost all of it is nude, you see. So that's a big sign of the Renaissance, you see, is that idea of we're not thinking about redemption anymore. We don't need Christ. We don't need the Redeemer. We can act on our own without any enlightenment and direction from Christ and the faith. You see, that's the spirit of the Renaissance. And that's a very evil spirit.
Well, it's only one step away from a noble savage.
Yes. So that's the turning point of Western Europe, and don't forget it's colonizing at this point too. So it's spreading all of these ideas everywhere, so that is a very, very bad turn for humanity.
So what good was lost culturally and religiously because of the Renaissance?
The reign of Christ in society. It was the beginning of the dethronement of Christ in society. The Middle Ages, if you study the Middle Ages, it is absolutely imbued with the idea of Christ being the king of everything, and his church being his representative upon earth, and therefore a great reverence for the church and the teachings of the church, the disciplines of the church. And were there sins committed? Yes, there were sins committed, but still the what you might call the operating system was perfect, in the sense that it was based on Christ the Redeemer and Christ the King and the next life and not this life, you see. So, as I always say, the only big contributions to culture and even technology in the Middle Ages were the cathedrals, theology, and Gregorian chant. Three magnificent things and contributions to the world. And that was the product. They were just as smart as we are, perhaps more intelligent. They could have made rockets if they had put their attention to rockets and all of the modern science that we know. They could have very easily. But they didn't. As a matter of fact, they didn't even improve much on the Romans. In other words, there was nothing essentially different between ancient times and medieval times technologically. All of their attention was on the next world and the things of God.
I was trying to create some letters there to match the three R's. You've got chant, catechesis, and cathedrals. You've got your three C's instead of the three R's.
What else is there from the Middle Ages? There are not many beautiful big houses, maybe one or two, or, a king's castle.
People are busy working the land rather than...
Yeah, but, even the rich people, though, you see what surrounds, say, Chartres and all of the great cathedrals of Europe. You don't see big mansions or anything like that. They're pretty ordinary homes, and whereas if you go to England after the Reformation, the big thing to see in England is either the pre-Reformation cathedrals, which are magnificent, built by Catholics for the Catholic Mass, or you go to see the big homes of the rich people that were on lands that were taken away from the monks. And you say, oh, this is a beautiful, look at that home, beautiful.
I wonder where they got the money to pay for that.
Yes, and the land, and et cetera, like Highclere. Well, whatever. I think that was a monastery. I think that was originally monastery land, but I don't know. I'm not accusing anybody.
Well, it's interesting, too, that you mentioned the idea of building rockets, and you can see this idea of classical culture even going back. What did they call the rockets? They were Saturn rockets, Titan, Jupiter.
Yes.
If we had had a Christianized, let's say, space exploration, this would be named after saints, the way that we used to name the boats and
everything.
And cities. And
everything was
rivers.
named for saints. I mean, even today, you drive around France and it's Saint this, Saint that. You drive around California and it's Saint this and Saint that. And all of Europe is full of saints, because it was all a culture of the supernatural. It was not a culture of the natural. And that was the beauty of the Middle Ages. And yes, life was hard, but and there were sins, definitely. But as I said, the operating system, to use a modern term, was correct.
Well, I'm smiling, watchers and listeners, because you have to understand how much the bishop doesn't like updates to the operating system. He resists updates, and so
just had one the other day. I can't.
So here he can see that the Renaissance was a poisonous update to the operating system, and that's why it should be resisted.
It always works worse after the update.
So, how did the church respond to the Renaissance?
The church, first of all, well, you have to link the Renaissance to the Reformation, but we might get to that later. But with regard to the Renaissance culture, it Christianized the Renaissance culture, which it does in any culture it goes into. It Christianizes whatever is good in it. So instead of building the Gothic cathedrals in the medieval style and Gregorian chant, it took on the polyphony in music, which was popular in the late Middle Ages, starting to get popular in the late Middle Ages. It also completely embraced the Renaissance architecture, the Roman style, and that turned into the Baroque. You see, because the tastes changed. The Baroque wanted to not think about an angel, which you might think about in a Gothic cathedral. It wanted to see an angel, and the wings should be made of gold, and you see, it should be, you are there. You see, I always say that the Gothic wants to lift you up. The Baroque takes heaven down to you. You see, you walk into a Baroque church, and this is like heaven here. Look at all this beautiful.
And either is okay. It's
Yes,
just an art
both
style.
work.
Some people have preferences. But...
They both work, but I would say the medieval is more accurate because you can't really reproduce heaven here. It's
Sure.
more accurate that you have to go up. not bring heaven down,
Sure.
but nonetheless, I mean, I enjoy a Baroque church and beautiful. It's so it Christianized it, and it does that with all cultures. It takes whatever is decent and good in it, and so it adapts itself to tastes. It does.
Well, and as you say, the Baroque is closer to us in time, so I think it's easier for modern man to understand that. You have to try to take them back into the Christianized Middle Ages to have them understand why a Gothic church is the way that it is, and
Yes.
okay, why does the light flow in this way, and
Yes.
how is it designed?
Yes.
So the church, you say the church responds by, where possible, Christianizing this instead of having, the pop songs of their time. You would have polyphony coming and
Yes.
developing.
It as a matter, it banned a lot of things that were creeping into the churches at that time.
So the next R here is either, if you'd refer to it as the Reformation, some people refer to it as the Protestant Revolt.
Revolt is better.
Is more accurate.
Yes, yes.
But so historically, some people may not understand what you mean. Obviously, you can just say, well, it's the Protestant Revolt. And what evils were given by the Protestant Revolt, Your Excellency?
The Protestant Revolt was a revolt against the priesthood. It was a throwing off of the authority of the Catholic Church and giving that authority to each individual. That was so. Whereas the Pope could not determine what you should believe, you determine what you should believe. So you pick up the Bible and you read, and then you think, well, this is what it's saying, and this is a free examination of the Scriptures. This is what is being said. This is the way I interpret it, and that's that. And it got rid of the visible church. Luther said the church is invisible, and it simply meets in communities. You see, there's these communities that exist, but there's no big visible church with authority. So it imbued the idea of individualism, and nobody's going to tell me what to do or to think into European culture. That I'm my own pope, and I can decide whatever I want to believe or do, etc. This had the effect of subjectivism, and that is, well, it's what you read the Bible, you say this, I read the Bible, I say this. Well, we both have faith. That means trust in God, and it really doesn't matter what we think, because what's true for you might be true for you, but it's not true for me, etc. That's subjectivism, and that will have a terrible effect in philosophy in Protestant countries. Immanuel Kant, the empiricists, the idealists, etc. Which that's a whole other.
Right.
It'll take me hours to talk about that. But that will be the effect, the worst effect of the Reformation, and also absolutism, because you see in the Middle Ages, the king was subject to he gained his power by all of these oaths that bound him and the people who took the oaths to a union because of those oaths. And the nobles would have to provide military service to him and obedience to him. In return, he would do certain things. So he was the king, but because of all of these oaths. And the Pope, if the king acted up, would just say, those oaths are now dispensed. You don't owe him anything. He would fall like a rock.
With Queen Elizabeth.
Well, that was the idea, but she didn't fall like a rock. But the Henry the Fourth of Germany, various others, so they lived in fear of that. That there was, if they acted up, the good examples. Philip II, who was a great Catholic king of Spain, he did not want to hand over a bishop to Rome to be judged, but wanted to judge him in Spain. The law was that bishops are not judged in their countries; they must go to Rome. So he told St. Pius V, which was the wrong person to say this to, I'm not sending the bishop to Rome. So St. Pius V said, if you don't, you will be excommunicated. And the bishop was sent to Rome.
It's remarkable how that works.
Yes, it moved him, you see, because he understood that relationship. But that eventually eroded so that even the Catholic kings didn't care what the Pope thought, you see, because they were imbued with all of these new ideas.
So my next question was what good was lost, and that was one of the first things is checks in the political order.
Yes.
So the people are somewhat protected from their rulers by the church.
Yes, and you see, then you had the rise of absolutism because Luther said that the ruler is the head of the church in his area. See, so therefore the kings love that. You see, not only am I king of all the land, I'm king of the religion too. So you even had Catholic kings such as Louis XIV saying, I am the head of the church in France. You see? And so that absolutism was very dangerous. It brought on the French Revolution because it was exaggerated, and there was no limit on it. You see, the Catholic Church prefers, in its philosophy, not its teaching necessarily, but in its philosophy, what is known as a temperate monarchy. And that is a monarchy that has certain rules that they cannot undo, or they must observe. Now, there's certain limitations, just as the papacy is considered a temperate monarchy too, because he cannot alter the faith. So he has a constitution, you might say, which is the given faith. He cannot alter that. Certain things that were not permitted to them to do. You see, so in the Middle Ages, for example, the king could not take away from a serf his land. And it was customary. That was a customary law. But that was the way it was, that the king had certain limitations on him. Also, that the power was spread out. You see, the church favors that in its philosophy, that the central power should be fairly weak and the local powers should be the ones that really decide. So you don't have people in Washington deciding what they should teach in the schools in Alaska, for example, which is completely stupid. And that local government is in a certain way more important than the central government. The central government takes care of foreign policy and general big policies of the country, but a limited monarchy that way. But with the Protestant idea, you had this absolute powerful superhuman king over everything, and that irritated people and led to great abuses, and that was one of the things that led to the French Revolution.
Well, what you're alluding to there, Your Excellency, also is that, say, the birth of capitalism, the church was a bulwark against this accumulation of wealth in someone who didn't have that wealth subordinated to a greater good. People could just accrue wealth for wealth's sake, whereas, as you said, in the Middle Ages, everything was moved towards the higher order. So when I died, I left how did the church get all that money? How did the church get all that real estate? Because people saw what was important. It wasn't necessarily dynasty building. It was building for the afterlife.
Yes.
And something else you mentioned, if it's an attack against the priesthood, what good was lost? Well, we lose sacraments. We lose certainty of doctrine.
Yes. The certitude of doctrine, I think, would be an excessive individualism. This idea that I'm like a little king and a little pope myself. And that will lead to democracy, which is a disaster.
So how did the church respond to the Protestant revolt?
By what is known as the Counter-Reformation, which was such a flourishing of Catholicism that it can hardly be exaggerated. The church, it was an age of saints. The church always bounces back from its bad days in a way that is better than it ever was before. In other words, it has a vitality that even when it's torn down and spit upon, it comes back with greater vitality than ever. And that was the Tridentine period, what we call the Counter-Reformation. And that lasted from about 1530 all the way up to Vatican II. And then that was the total destruction. That was like a 50 megaton bomb on the Catholic Church, and I don't have to get into that.
So as you noted, architecture, music, the Jesuits and all of the, at that time, good things that they did, St. Charles Borromeo, and setting the tone for what you do here in terms of a seminary, how that's run.
Seminaries, yes,
There's
because
rules.
the clergy were not well trained. There was a corruption that they were not well trained, and so the Council of Trent said we should have seminaries, and St. Charles Borromeo was really pushing that. That's why he's the patron of seminaries, and everything changed. For the good. It was everything was much more organized and much more centralized. The Mass was codified. It used to be that the traditional Mass was said in various places, and each diocese might have its own little rites and everything. St. Pius V codified all of it, and so it became uniform, which was very good, because, again, there was colonial expansion, and so it was good that the whole world should be saying Mass the same way. See?
And I think that's something else that we take for granted, Your Excellency. We're in a post-Tridentine period, and so we have all of the benefits of all the things you alluded to: centralization, normalization. This is how things are. We have a ritual, we have a pontifical. This is
Yes.
how things are. And I think sometimes Catholics think, oh, well, this is how it's always been. It's like, well, actually, it's quite recent in church history.
Relatively recent, yes.
And if you study the history of the Council of Trent, what a miracle it was that that council was even pulled off. All of the intrigues, and we're going to move here, and there's a plague, and these bishops aren't going to show up, and we have to have it in a German-speaking city, and
All sorts of Trent was a compromise between Italy and the empire, which is Germany. We'll do it in Trent, so it's very close to the, at that time it was probably even German language maybe. But yes, so there was all sorts of obstacles to it. And with any kind of council, it's something like what Bismarck said about making laws. Sausage and making laws, two things you don't want to see.
right.
There's so many arguments, controversies back and forth, and factions of who's on what side of this dogma and whatnot. It's something you don't want to see. But again, the church is assisted by the Holy Ghost, and that council produced just a magnificent set of documents and anathemas and clarity for the age to come. It was the best council ever.
I would recommend our watchers and listeners to study. There's many ways that you can study about the Council of Trent. But I think just looking at the deliberations, you're going to see, okay, well, we're going to move this deliberation here. Our bishop's resident in their diocese. Is this because God said so? The church said so, however. And just realizing the church hadn't settled that. And we're talking this 1,500 years have passed,
Yes.
and it took this council to do that. And I do see the Council of Trent in itself as miraculous. That the fact that they were able to pull it off with all that was going on in Europe, the political destabilization, sickness, disease, personalities, as you say, and trying to manage it. I think someone had said, well, where does the Holy Spirit reside at the Council of Trent? Well, it arrives in the mailbag from Rome, once a week to the legates.
And they invited the Protestants to come to the Council of Trent in order to talk. So this idea that the church was never interested in converting anybody or listening to heretics to try to bring them around and have their concerns aired, that's just all nonsense. It's as if that never existed before Vatican II.
Am I remembering correctly, Your Excellency, that Pius IX invited a number of the schismatics, and
Yes.
none of them showed up either?
Correct.
So that gets us to our third R, which is revolution. So what evils were given us by, let's say, revolution broadly, French, American, and then 1848 and beyond?
Well, the American Revolution was sort of the pre-intonation or the hors d'oeuvre for the French Revolution, which in turn gave rise to many revolutions in the 19th century. The thinking of the Renaissance, again, no savior, no established Christianity. That's Protestantism. You see, it's each one has his own idea, and you can. The thinking that generated the American thought at the time was principally from John Locke, who was a deist. See, God exists, but he created the world, but now he doesn't care about it. We don't owe him anything. And we can organize our lives entirely upon reason. You see? That's John Locke in a sentence. That everything should be run by reason, and there should be no establishment of religion. He was in favor of religious liberty for everybody except atheists and Catholics. Okay, that to give you the idea of what this kind of person was. And so Thomas Jefferson was deeply, deeply influenced by John Locke. And he was the author of the Declaration of Independence and also contributed a great deal to the Constitution. So it was this new nation based on pure reason. See, that was unheard of. See, that in itself was revolution, because the 18th century was the age of reason. You see, this extolling of reason. That's because the intellectuals of Europe dumped Protestantism. It's because it was absurd. Everybody having his own idea and everything like that. They really didn't have any respect for it at all. But they became deists, and that is, well, yes, there's a creator, but he doesn't care about us. We don't owe him anything except maybe a certain honor. That's all. You see, but man is left to his own lights. You see, his own ideas, etc. That was the spirit of the 18th century, and America was created in that spirit. And all of the people that came from Europe to help with the American War of Independence were all filled with these ideas. Lafayette was an atheist, okay? Von Steuben, Pulaski, all of these other people that came from Europe, and a lot of French lieutenants and so forth came over, all imbued with these ideas. Because it was seen as the new dawn of an age without the establishment of religion, an age with a country without established religion. So that was the effect of the Reformation, the Renaissance, and you had this early revolution in revolutionary thinking. When I say revolutionary, totally new thinking. That's what I mean. That also that you can rise up against governments when they go against the sovereignty of the people.
Because that's where power comes from, Your Excellency.
Yes, that's another error of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All of that thinking, that all the power resides in the people, and they just lend it to the government, and they can take it back whenever they want.
Because they disregarded the social contract that I signed.
Right, yes. And so it's a mob rule, you see, and the government is there just to be sort of, you could have AI in the Congress, and that would, and people could just vote on their computers, and that would be that. It might work a lot better than what we have right now.
And if you know what low opinion His Excellency has of AI, you realize what an insult that is.
Yes, just have all these machines in there and just people let them vote,
What other goods were lost? You've listed a number of evils here. What other goods were lost? There were so many evils introduced here. But I suppose, in one sense, the stability of government. France has had 13 forms of government, I think, in the time that America has had one form of government. All of those.
Yes. Well, let's get to the French Revolution first. The French Revolution took all of the ideas that I just talked about, compacted them, made them worse, you might say, radicalized them, and then put them in a catapult and spread them all over Europe. I mean, France was the leading country of the whole world at the time, the most prosperous country, and the country that was, how would you say, placed on a cultural pedestal by all of Europe.
Cultural superpower.
Yes, which is it's actually more important even than a military superpower. You are influencing everybody. So you have to understand that about France. That was it. The world was France, and in that time, that 18th century. So the French Revolution and then Napoleon came and did spread it all over Europe. You see, so it was not confined to France, even though other countries did not want the revolution. They could declare war on France, etc. Napoleon came out and spread the revolution everywhere. And on his dying breath, he said, the revolution must be, maintained and encouraged. So wherever he went, he revolutionized all the governments and all the processes. He got rid of all of the old monarchies, or at least, I shouldn't say that. He maintained some of the old monarchies, but they had to revolutionize their governments.
Make your kid the king of Rome, for example.
Yes, but other things, local governments especially were revolutionized, That would be a whole other, but so he spread it all over the place, something like a manure spreader. I would, but that's the French Revolution. So it was the combination of everything from the Renaissance, Protestantism, the Age of Reason, all of this just exploded in that. See?
And how did the church respond?
Condemned it. All right. Pius VI condemned it very, very, and he was Pope up from 1774 to 1799. Pius VII, he's 1800 to 1822, I think. He tried to get along with it. He was somewhat influenced as a cardinal and as the bishop of, I forget where he was. He was reading things that were of the 18th century bent. So he was elected as someone to somehow get along with this revolution, and that was what he pursued. So then you had the Concordat with Napoleon, which, in my opinion, was a disaster for France. Many people think it was the most wonderful thing he ever did, but it's only my opinion.
That's a different episode as
That's
well.
another whole episode, is the Concordat. But but he was against the spirit and ideas of the French Revolution. In other words, he was not a revolutionary he just wanted to get along with the powers that be in France and the rest of Europe. Somehow the church has to survive in this, and we're going to get along with it. So that was Pius VII. But he did condemn, for example, in the 1814 Charter, the Charte, which is a constitution, when Louis XVIII came back to the throne after the Napoleonic period, it called for religious liberty in France, and he condemned that. He said that this is, kind of very, very clearly condemned. That was the earliest show of religious liberty in Catholic countries. You see, so that has been condemned even from that time, 1814. And he was, again, not of a hardline bent. He was no Pius IX or Pius X. So he was accommodationist, what we call an accommodationist. And then you had a series of popes in the 19th century. Some were leaning more toward accommodation to the revolutionary governments. Some were leaning more against them. You see, Gregory the 16th was very much against them. Leo the 12th was very much against it. Pius VIII, who reigned only for a year or two, was more conciliatory. None of these people were non-Catholics, nothing like Bergoglio or anything like that. They're just, how do you deal with this kind of thing? Pius IX was an early accommodationist toward the revolution. Gregory the 16th said that in his family, everyone is liberal, including the cat. That's what Gregory
and it's bad when the cat's liberal.
Yes, when the cat is liberal, that's really bad. That's what Gregory the 16th said about his family, and it was true. They were totally imbued.
Well, if someone had said, "Are you sure that you're going to make him a cardinal?" Because in that family, that's a problem. And mysteriously, Gregory the 16th still proceeded.
He did. Yes, that was the Mastai Ferretti family. But then, when a revolution broke out in Rome, he made a whole bunch of changes in the Papal States in accordance with all of the 19th century thinking. The post-revolution
constitution.
Yes, assembly, everything, lay control of lay government. The person that he put in as the head of the lay government, who was Rossi, had his throat slit on the steps of a building where they were meeting, and by the revolutionaries, who were afraid precisely that the revolution would be tempered by Pius IX's concessions. They wanted a radical revolution. So that's when Garibaldi came into Rome in 1848 and spread pornography all over the city. He also put horses, etc., in St. Peter's Basilica, and the soldiers were riding around in vestments taken from the basilica all around Rome. They raped nuns. They pillaged Rome. It was awful.
So that radicalized Pius IX in the other direction.
He saw that. He escaped dressed as a simple priest and came back eventually to Rome, and he condemned everything about the revolution. And he was Pope until 1878. Long reign from 1846 to 1878. And then came Leo XIII, who was just the opposite. He was more accommodationist with regard to the revolutionary and now pagan governments, especially of France.
The Ralliement.
And the Ralliement, which I think was another disaster. The idea of the Ralliement was, we will be nice to you, Third Republic, which is the awful atheist republic of France, which destroyed the faith in France. It got rid of the religious orders, got rid of the Catholic schools. It was horrible. We'll be nice to you, and we'll tell Catholics to support the government, but we expect you to be nice back to us. That was the rationale of the Ralliement. It was a total disaster. And I was told that even he regretted it on his deathbed, that his policies with France were terrible. You see, and again, France was the big Catholic country. You see, it was a very influential country. There was Protestant England, but nobody cared about that. From the point of view of Catholic nations in Europe, France was it.
Yeah,
So,
even in its degraded state, they were the ones who rescued the Holy Father
yes,
during
in
that time period.
1848, even though Napoleon III at the time was a Carbonarist, which means a type of Freemasonry, but his wife was very pious, and Spanish princess. And yes, I mean the France was the principal protector of the papacy, and it was, still had very, very Catholic roots, France. And there was in the 19th century there was a Catholic revival after the Revolution. There was just like the Catholic Church returns, with greater fervor. There was a big Catholic revival in France. So the Vatican naturally looked to France as the big player in Catholic Europe, and it was. It was also a very powerful and rich country in the 19th century. Yes.
So those three R's, Your Excellency, culture, religion, and politics are represented. The Renaissance for culture, the Revolt, obviously, against religion directly. And then once you've dealt with religion, now we can get to politics. And I think sometimes people don't realize when they're so excited and agitated about politics that they're already down at the third rung of the ladder, that the battle was fought over religion. And before that, culture, which people could move slowly, oh, it's just a painting. Well, it's the beginning of this whole story.
Yes.
So I suppose that's a way for us as Catholics to be more aware kaleidoscopically of what's going on around us, Your Excellency, what's going on in the culture, what's going on in religion, what's going on in politics, and realize these battles have been being fought for 500 years, and the evil side has made great progress. But the church has led ways on how to respond in each of these areas, and it's up to us now that we don't have Catholic governments around anymore, that we have to do this on an individual level or with our family. We have to fight against the art, the culture.
They have to understand that we have inherited a non-Catholic culture and even an anti-Catholic culture. All right? They also have to understand that Vatican II is an attempt to marry the Catholic Church to this new non-Catholic and anti-Catholic culture that explains the whole new religion. All right? So, for example, what's infinite dignity? And everything that you do wrong is against human dignity. Very typical of the whole thing. You see, that's human dignity. That's the Renaissance, man is man, It's a sin, that's what it is. It's against the law of God. It's not because it's against some human dignity. See, that would be the Catholic Church's response to that. You see, but the Novus Ordo is just, and the same idea, if we accept all of the principles of the modern world will become religious. And
it hasn't worked out. The throat has been slit.
Yes, Baltimore says it's proposing the closing of 40 churches. Baltimore. This is where Catholicism was born in this country. Baltimore, reducing the number of parishes from 61 to 21. And the bishop said, well, the mass attendance, especially among the young, has plummeted. That was what the Archbishop of Baltimore said. When will you wake up? When will you look around at the orders, even those that are under the aegis of the Vatican, which are traditional? They are attracting young people. They are getting vocations.
Especially among the young.
Yes, they are the ones. And you look at the traditional Latin masses, even the ones permitted by the Vatican, they are attracting young families. When will you wake up, you people? If that happened to your business, you'd say, we have to sit down with a new business plan. Look at this. We are closing 2/3 of our churches.
That's the reality.
And the young people are not interested in what we have to say. I mean, you are a failure. You are a dismal, dismal failure. Why don't you just resign and get an honest job? That's what I would say to those prelates.
But His Excellency using his normal, soft, and cuddly language. So I thank Father Fahey for giving this intro for us to talk about. I would encourage our watchers and listeners to check out some of his works. Thank you, Your Excellency, for walking us through. This is obviously centuries of history and theology that we've tried to compress into this episode, but hopefully it leads our watchers and our listeners to go and read some of this yourself. You can do this in each category. If you want to study the Revolt, you can study the Council of Trent. You can study the Catechism of the Council of Trent, a very fine catechism, Your Excellency.
It's the best that it was ever put out.
Framework of a Christian State, if you want to understand.
Yes, Father Cahill SJ, yes.
the Revolution.
Very good, yes.
And what about with art and music, Your Excellency? Would there something you'd push them towards there?
Art and
Other
music.
than listening to some good music, or
Well, certainly just looking at medieval art and good Renaissance and like Fra Angelico, for example, early Renaissance, magnificent art. The the art of the church when there was a Catholic culture, just paging through and looking at it would do wonders for you. And listening to chant, listening to polyphony, and even the classical period of music when music was rational and ordered, etc., Bach and Mozart, the people like that. It's very ordering of the intellect and your soul, all of those things. And then you start to realize what kind of world we're living in when you see what reality is, what it should be.
well, thank you as always for your time, Your Excellency. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit like, hit subscribe, share this with people who might like to understand how our modern world was constituted and the steps that got us there. You can also send a super thanks that will support the seminary. There's a link in the description to allow you to donate directly if you prefer to do it that way. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you.